Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and today we have an absolutely amazing guest with us, David Gushee. He is a uh, professor of Christian ethics at Mercer University and the Free University of Amsterdam. He's also a senior research fellow at the International Baptist Theological Study Center. That's a mouthful. So, in other words, he's a lot smarter than I am. David, welcome to the podcast.
Michael, it's good to be with you. Thanks for wanting to speak with me.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation. I wanted to, highlight what we're going to talk about is your book here, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And I really like the way it's worded here that we're really going to be try to be advocates for sane, ethical, compassionate politics in a world where many Christians are instigating discord and vying for power. And I would add that many Christians are becoming more retributive in their politics and their worldview and theology. And then finally, our goal really is to get some insight into what democracy is truly meant to be. So, thanks for being with us. I saw you speak at the Wild Goose Festival, and I saw your book, and I've seen your name around a lot. So I'm really glad that I could finally connect with you. I thought where we would start is to get our audience an understanding of what your background is. Um, the line that I have here, I can actually relate to. I just have to change a couple words, and it's pretty much me. But you became a born again Southern Baptist evangelical, and decades later got kicked out of evangelicalism. I would just change from me, I would just take out the word Southern and add the word Baptist and then charismatic. And then everything else is the same, except for our academic careers. But so how would you summarize that story of your evolution?
Yeah, I grew up Catholic, and it didn't really I didn't really connect with it very well. My mother was very disappointed about that, but I went wandering into the spiritual wilderness in high school, and then as a 16-year-old, I had some friends in a local Southern Baptist church, and I wandered in there one summer afternoon on my own, and 4 days later, I was a newly converted Southern Baptist.
That is so familiar, man.
That
It's
happened,
your
you know?
it's your formative years, especially the teen years or early 20s. It's very common.
Yeah, 16 years old. I was looking for something I didn't know how to name, and they knew how to
Right.
name it, and there you go, right? So I plunged in very deeply into the Southern Baptist subculture. Um, Felt called to be a pastor within 6 months. Um, Went to Southern Baptist Seminary. I served in Southern Baptist churches. I got ordained as a Southern Baptist minister as a 25-year-old. But
Wow.
then I went to Union Seminary in New York to get a PhD in Christian ethics, which broadened my horizons. But still, I've only taught at 3 schools full time, all of them Baptist, and each one more open-minded than the one before. So I taught at
Mhm.
Southern Baptist Theological Seminary for 3 years, had to leave there over the issue of women in ministry.
Right.
And then I went to Union University in West Tennessee for 11 years. Didn't have to leave, but kind of had to, over taking stands on issues like climate change and torture.
That's I
And
mean, and the climate change I get, but taking a stand on torture and you got kicked out? What?
yeah, because it was a Republican president, right? George W.
Oh,
Bush, right? All
oh
that.
my gosh. I know.
Just
That's
after
that's a
9/11,
sad
yeah.
sad story there.
Yeah, it is. And then in 2007, Mercer based in Georgia, came in and gave me an offer I couldn't refuse and gave me academic freedom. And the now for 16 years, I've been pursuing my calling here. And it was halfway through that experience that I wrote a book called Changing Our Mind, which
Mhm.
called for full LGBTQ inclusion in the church. And it ended up uh, being probably the most important book I've written so far. And it's changed lives and helped a lot of people accept themselves and helped a lot of churches change their mind. but it helped a lot of evangelicals decide that I was a heretic and that I needed to be kicked out.
Yeah,
So
that was the last straw,
that
right.
was 2014, right? So since then, I've been in post-evangelical space, and
Right.
I've been helping. I mean, thinking on my own, and also thinking with post-evangelicals about where we go from here. So that's kind of
Yeah.
my journey. Yeah.
Well, many of us are on that same journey. You're in good company. The Heretics Club or whatever we wanna call it. But,
Yeah, never
really,
expected to be in the Heretics Club, but I wear it as a badge of honor at this point in terms of who the adversaries are. You know.
I know, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, when I first got into the evangelical church in the late '70s, I mean, there were still some of these issues out there, but it's just gotten worse over the years. I just can't believe how political, et cetera, and how people can accept things just because, like torture, just because it's on the right political side,
Right.
blows me away. Anyways, let's get into one of the terms that you bring up in your book is authoritarian reactionary Christianity. Where does that come from? And is that different from Christian nationalism? Give us a definition of that.
Yeah, I made that term up because as I was doing the analysis of the problems that we're dealing with, I concluded that it was more descriptive of the problem. So,
Okay.
so Christian nationalism, it's a religious nationalism is an old term in the literature, having to do with, you might say, a hyper fusion of religion and nationalism, often leading to violence. So that expression goes back a long way. Um, the more recent usage of the term Christian nationalism began in the sociology literature around the year 2000 in a book by Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry called Taking America Back for God. And my reading of the literature that has emerged from that uh, research is essentially what they are describing is the vision of the kind of country that some American Christians would like. So it's a Christian nation that looks white dominated, patriarchal. Um, the native born have preeminence. There's a xenophobia, anti-immigrant posture.
Mhm.
Anti-gay or anti-LGBTQ. Um, and essentially, kind of a backward looking, um, make America great again here means make America a white, conservative, straight male, Christian dominated country. Okay.
Mhm. Right.
So I think that's all true. I think that is essentially the goal of a lot of people that I'm also talking about. But here's what I think the language in my book adds. Reactionary names the spirit of fierce counterattack, counter-revolution, negative reaction to social changes that conservative and traditional Christians don't like. And a easy way to think about it is think about everything that has changed in our culture since about 1962, and
Right.
then think about people who are against all of those changes.
Right, right, right.
Right? Maybe some more changes are more important to them than others. It might be about ethnicity, or it might be about gender, or it might be about abortion, it might be about sexuality, might be about immigration, but a fierce negative counter reaction, um, draped in the flag and also draped in Christianity, right?
Mhm.
Um, and then authoritarianism names an anti-democratic approach to power that tends to support the centralization of power in the hands of a few people who are understood to be worthy of it.
Right, right.
Um, and and so the book makes a pretty careful argument about how there's a lot of authoritarianism just in conservative and traditional religion anyway, right? Um, and that doesn't matter that much most of the time, except to those who are in those systems that are never allowed to raise a question or to have a voice.
Mhm.
But where it's mattering politically is if those folks get activated to be opposed to the normal functioning of democracy in their country and not just against democratic practices in their churches. And
Right.
that's what I think is happening now.
Right.
So, fueled by fierce negative reaction to cultural changes they don't like, attracted to authoritarian solutions because they've lost confidence in democracy, and they're mobilizing now politically in a way that threatens democracy. That's my argument.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, what you described has really kind of been going on for, 30, 40 years in evangelicalism, but it's kind of slowly progressed to a greater degree where, the reactions are stronger.
Mhm.
The changes are more gay marriage all of a sudden. Oh, we have to react to that.
Yeah.
You know, the demonizing of liberals and Democrats and the other side, et cetera, just gets worse and worse. Is this what you're
Yeah.
describing? Yeah.
Yeah. And I actually show in the book that that you can see negative reactions to modern changes on the part of traditional Christians as far back as the early modern world.
Right.
You can see it in the 17th century, in the 18th century, in the 19th century.
It's not a new phenomenon,
Not a
in
new
other words.
phenomenon. You can
Yeah.
see it in different countries.
Right.
Um, but I would say yes. So, the Supreme Court says, oh, by the way, principals and teachers, you can't lead school sponsored prayers, right? You can't do that.
Yeah. Right.
1962. Oh, all of a sudden they're trying to take God out of the schools, right?
Right.
Civil rights movement, immigration from the global South, the feminist movement,
Mhm.
abortion, you name it, right?
Yep.
Um, and I would say the continued defeat of the traditionalist side in battle after battle, state after state, issue after issue, um, the constant kind of regrouping to make a new counterattack and losing again. Yeah, I think it somehow has reached a critical mass, and the reactionary spirit is more angry, more fearful, and might even say less in touch with reality than ever before.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense, right. I mean, really, it's a rejection of having a true pluralistic society where, you don't have to be the same religion, you don't have to be, just like us in the church or whatever, and just also, and my circles also was always coming up with, an explanation that God really wants us as Christians to take control or
Yeah.
have undue influence on the government and our country, and that's what really we're trying to do, is because that's God's will. So they've got the will of God behind them and all these initiatives. So, what about some examples from recent history? Besides the U.S., where has this, we're going to call it authoritarian reactionary Christianity. Where has this arc showed up in recent history? And I know you wrote about Germany and the quasi Christianity of Nazism. And also, I'd like to touch on Russia because that's in the news a lot.
Yeah. I have two longer term chapters where I talk about France in the 19th and early 20th century and Germany leading
Mm-hmm.
up to the Nazi era. That looked a little bit different in those two countries, but in both those cases, it was a fierce negative reaction to everything modern, which included urbanization and industrialization
Oh,
and
really?
capitalism. Yeah.
Hmm.
The emancipation of the Jews to a place of civic equality. Um, so there's an economic dimension of this that should not be missed. I don't emphasize it as strongly in my book in the modern chapters, but the idea that um, there are people kind of romanticizing a mythic past of small town, Christian, rural homogeneity dominated by Christians. That was in France, that was in Germany. And now some of those same notes are struck. I study 5 countries in the modern section: Russia, Poland, Hungary, Brazil, and the US.
Right.
And in each of them, I think you can see authoritarian reactionary Christianity. Like Putin, part of how he has held on to power for 23 years has been to say, I, Vladimir Putin, am the defender of Christian civilization in Europe.
Wow.
Putin, think about his behavior, right? I, Vladimir Putin, am defending Russia against the West. I'm defending the Orthodox Church against liberalism. I'm defending all of us against those awful gay people who are trying to foist their values on our children. And Putin was lionized by American evangelicals like Franklin Graham until the invasion of Ukraine full scale in 2022. And now a lot of the positive attention has gone over to Viktor Orban in Hungary. But what they have in common is, just picture this, and is, I am the strong man who doesn't limit I don't limit myself within the boundaries of democracy, because we're in a civilizational struggle
Right.
to defend Christian values and Christian religion
Right.
against all
Right.
that. And I'm the one to do
Right.
it. I alone can fix it, you
Well,
might say.
gee, yeah, sounds familiar. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, yeah, but you're saying that they're defending Christianity. It's like it's getting out of hand, but I'm the one that's going to bring it back, and this is what people want. At least
A lot of people do.
devoted Christians, a lot of them want to have Christianity in paramount in every sphere of life, and they just and if they do tolerate other religions, their goal really is to convert them or use them in some way. So
One
uh,
way to think about this, Michael, is like, people who are used to being in charge have to share power now.
yeah,
So you've got atheists running for office, and you've got secular folks teaching in universities as well as
right,
folks, and you got media offerings that don't reflect your values, and it's a pluralistic society with people of lots of different skin tones and religions and values, and a lot of people are very uncomfortable with that, and they might be willing to tolerate that diversity as long as they could resume control. That would be
right.
okay
Yeah,
with
well,
me.
that makes
Right.
sense. Right.
Yeah.
So just touch on Germany just a minute. I mean, Hitler obviously wasn't a real Christian, but he used Christianity in some way. What did he do?
He did. I was able to show in the chapter that for about 80 years before he came along, there had been a kind of a romantic quasi-Christian movement that had all of these elements that I've been describing, like romantic about what they called blood and soil, the connection to the land,
Hmm.
good sturdy peasant stock, romantic about pre-industrial civilization, romantic about Christian dominance, even if they couldn't quite agree on which Christian should be dominant. Romantic about a strongman ruler instead of all these squabbling parliamentarians. Romantic about a nation stronger than all the other nations and able to exert its will. And Christianity was remade to fit that vision.
I see. And then,
Anti-Semitism was part of it too. They taught some of these guys that Jesus was anti-Jewish. He wasn't. Not only was he not Jewish, he was anti-Jewish.
oh,
And
really?
so they remade Jesus as a kind of an Aryan Germanic folk hero.
Oh, I gotcha. Now, was this before,
It was before Hitler.
1933
It
even?
was. It was before
Okay.
1933.
All right.
So people who were already believing this had gotten organized into different movements in some cases, and they were ripe for the plucking when Hitler came to power. They had already bought the ideology.
Yeah, and from what I understand, a lot of it was rooted in grievance from how they were treated after World War I, and the economy was tanking and all that stuff. But
That was part of the jet fuel in the period right after World War One. But what the chapter shows is this romantic utopianism about a past
right.
that we would like to recover goes back before World War One, goes into the 19th century.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, another really interesting thing of the history on this is that you cite this guy named Walzer, who argues that there were three successful secular revolutions: Israel, India, and Algeria. But within like a couple decades, they changed from being a secular revolution to more of a fundamentalist religious mindset or worldview.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you about that, how that happened in Israel, since Israel is in the news these days.
Yeah. Israel, founded out of the ashes of the Holocaust, though there had been folks gradually moving into the old land of Israel for decades, beginning for a long time, but especially beginning in the late 19th century. But the founders of the modern state of Israel were they were secular for the most part, They were labor-oriented. They were essentially socialist Zionists.
Okay.
They wanted a homeland for the Jewish people. They believed that the traditional Jewish religiosity was not helpful for a modern state, and they wanted to kind of bracket it and not have it be central to the state. So Walzer, who is Jewish, says that the original founders from 1948 were secular Zionist revolutionaries, you might say, and they built a
What
country. This was
was
the
this?
Labor Party.
Was this
Yeah,
Ben Gurion and
in that era. That's right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And but that developments after 1967 and 1973, the two wars, among other things, when Israel defeated its adversaries in 67 and occupied Palestinian territory that had been set aside for a Palestinian state, and then began settling it with hundreds of thousands of settlers, it took, Walzer says, it took generally a certain kind of person to want to go where they weren't really wanted, and to even do things that generally are understood to be against international law. And so he talks about the kind of tough settler, the settler folks who went into the occupied territories. And some of these were secular folks, but a lot of them were religious Zionists. They were Jewish religious Zionists. They believed that taking the whole of the land between the Jordan and the Mediterranean was Israel's birthright from God. So from 1967 forward and accelerating gradually in the decades, more and more of the population of Israel has become either ultra-Orthodox or kind of settler militant.
Okay.
But there's also plenty of people who have the older vision, who are secular or who are more, they're not really militant in that way. They want peace with the Palestinians. And so Israel has been a very divided society for a while. And that was what the news was coming out of Israel before recent events, right? The protests in the streets over what Netanyahu's government was doing.
Right.
So one might say that Netanyahu and his cabinet in this last round represented a kind of authoritarian, reactionary Judaism or Jewish vision.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Because he went really far to the right, and he brought on apparently brought on some questionable characters into his government.
For sure.
Outright bigots, etc.
Right. Yeah. So that helps us understand what's happening now, because that kind of cabinet has had people in it who have been, I think, intentionally provocative and inflammatory of Palestinian sensitivities.
Okay.
In the West Bank, and also at in the very sensitive area around the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those things really had an impact, and this was just in the last, I think, since last the first of the year, right? That these changes have taken place.
Like thousands of people going to the area up on the Temple Mount that was understood to be reserved for Muslims. If you visit Jerusalem, as I have a couple times, there's an area for the Jewish community at the bottom of that wall, and an area for the Muslim community at the top of the Temple Mount, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. And it's a very sensitive area, and the way peace is kept is everybody stays in their spot. But there have been people in this cabinet who have been kind of parading up there just to, you might say, to create a provocation.
Right. Now that's that's very interesting and concerning when you hear something like that. I mean, so all right, what about how does Christian Zionism play into this? Because obviously, all of a sudden, not only are there Jewish people who are more settler motivated or religious, have some religious overtones, but the Christian right in the U.S. especially has just dove in and supported Israel for their own reasons. So what about that?
It's an awful example of Christians doing some really questionable theology and having some really disastrous political consequences. Basically, the backstory here is, at a broad level, Christian sense of identification with the Holy Land because of reading the Bible all these years, right? We know all of these locations, and we have a sense of, oh, this is precious territory. This is holy land,
Right.
right?
Right.
But then you also have the people who read the founding of the modern state of Israel in apocalyptic terms as ushering in the events of the last days.
Mm-hmm.
And most of those folks have also believed that, or acted as if, Israel reclaiming all of the territory of their historic homeland between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, the biggest extent, is part of God's will. In other words, Palestinians have been invisible in this story. They don't
Right.
matter.
Right. Yeah.
So a
It's
very
part of
powerful,
prophecy, prophetic
that's right, all that.
words are being fulfilled in this Israel
Yes,
coming and creating a new nation. Yeah.
that's right. And so the idea that Palestinians would share that Holy Land just didn't compute. It wasn't part of the story. So now the fact that the end of the story for most Christian Zionists is Jesus comes back on the Mount of Olives and everybody
Right.
converts.
Right. Yeah.
That's a little inconvenient, but the impact of it is many Christian Zionists who are reading this story have been very hard line in support of very hardline Israeli policies. It's like they're living in a mythic apocalyptic world, but the policy implications of living in that world are really bad for the people who live in the actual territory right now.
Right. Yeah. No, it's amazing. I think the phrase that comes to me in these situations is the ends justifies the means. So you've got people who claim to follow Jesus in this case, who taught us to love our enemies. But because this is part of the prophetic will of God, well, and this is going to, usher in the return of Christ. Well, we can do these things, these other things that are, more hardline and more retributive because of that. I mean, maybe they don't say that out loud or think that, but that seems to be what's going on.
I would say ends justify the means thinking is growing in the part of the Christian community that we're talking about here. I
Yeah,
mean, and not
right,
just there, not just on this issue.
right. So, all right, since we have this Israel-Hamas, this terrible war going on with Israel and Hamas, and you're a Christian ethicist, so what are your thoughts on a Christian response to this war?
Christians should be on the side of peace and freedom and dignity and justice for every human being and every
Hmm.
group.
Yep.
Um, the original UN plan was that the new state of Israel and a Palestinian state would share that territory. In the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. We should still have that dream. How to negotiate the exact territorial contours is a matter for the diplomats, but um, there have been a lot of missed opportunities to make peace. Some really near misses.
Yeah.
Um, I would say a long history of violence and counter violence, of insult and counter insult and growing hatred, and the radicalization of a part of both populations, Palestinian and Israeli, is a fact. And I would say that Hamas represents an especially radicalized vision that committed atrocious mass murder and every other kind of war crime a couple
Right.
weeks ago. And that those crimes should be named for what they are, absolute atrocities that can have no justification. But that if the answer by Israel is to bulldoze Gaza under rubble without sufficient care for the well-being of civilians, that is also not okay.
Right.
So we need to be supporting peace and dignity and justice for all, and listening to the peacemakers who are already on the ground on both sides, who have relationships, who are trying to help people dig out from their radicalization and move in a more constructive direction. And that's what we should be pushing for.
Right. Yeah, it's very sad. I mean, it just seems like there's a war crime happens and then the response is another war crime. And it's just, it's been going on like this for so many years, but it's very complex political situation. And I think, just having this kind of conversation about the background and, the historical uh, events that happened that led to this really helps people to understand it and also come up with a better way to respond to it rather than just a retributive way.
Right. Yeah. And just kind of being loyal to one side is not adequate. I mean, even just in terms of Christian ethics, because of the value and worth of all people. Right.
Right. Yes. Right. And yeah. And you can find a way to uh, be loyal to anyone who suffers on both sides and really, and that's what we need to do. I mean, we need to, we can't be one sided about it. Uh, that's the way I look at it. So,
I agree.
um, let's kind of pivot now and uh, talk about how authoritarian reactionary Christianity, has emerged in recent years in the U.S. We've talked about it a little, but particularly since 2015, 16 during the Trump administration.
Um, I think that, let's say that we already had reactionary spirit going back 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And let's say we already had plenty of authoritarianism in the Christian subculture.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's hard to deny either of those claims. Um, what Trump did was to introduce openly anti-democratic, that is, the rules of democracy, but also the norms of democracy. He routinely violated them from the very beginning of his first campaign. So he introduced an authoritarian element even in the process of capturing the Republican voters and then winning the White House and then being president.
So, can you give some examples?
Well, in the book, I talk about there were scholars, political scientists who were talking as early as 2017. Watch out for example, whenever anybody says that political opponents are enemies of the country and don't really care about the country, or whenever threats of violence are introduced into public speech,
Right.
or whenever
Right.
politicians pick out specific groups to be like scapegoated,
Right.
as Trump did when he came down that escalator that very first day, right?
Right.
Or when the media is described as the enemy of the people.
Right.
So from the beginning, he was violating democratic norms. And then during his presidency, he did enough things to violate democratic norms and possibly democratic laws that he got impeached, first for the Ukraine deal, right? And then of course for what happened after January 6th. Things really took off with the attempt to say that the election was rigged, and then to challenge the results of the election, and then finally the insurrection of January 6th. And the fact that he sat on his hands during January 6th, that applauded the insurrectionists and didn't call them off and all of that. He's been indicted for these things, and we'll see what happens. But
Right.
so let's just say Trump took anti-democratic authoritarianism and mainstreamed it in a way that that hadn't been done in memory, at least.
Right. So, but he also played off of the grievances that evangelicals or the religious right had, and so his anti-democratic statements or actions were really things. A lot of them were things that, oh yeah, if that would happen, we'd be okay with that because that would help our agenda.
I think that the norms of democracy, like for example, remember when he was asked, "Do you pledge to accept the results of the election?"
Right.
And he said, "No, not necessarily," and then he
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah. Right.
Right? Or even
I think
just
he also said, if I don't win, it was obviously rigged.
right, yeah,
Even
and
before the election.
even when he essentially blessed the paramilitary group, the Proud Boys,
Yes.
all of that is boundary breaking. all of that is
Mhm.
what happens in autocracies, not democracies.
Right.
When the militias come out, I mean, you're really in trouble, right?
Yeah. Right.
So so I think Trump legitimized behaviors that had not been legitimized by the mainstream political candidates. Reagan didn't do things like that.
Yeah.
George W. Bush didn't do things like that. So, um, and because he legitimized the previously unthinkable, it became thinkable. So
Yeah.
he did play an indispensable role, but the grievances and the authoritarianism, in a sense, were already there.
Yeah. And I think that when he was elected in 2016, there was this m- um, there's this buzz going around evangelical fundamentalist circles that, oh, this is the will of God, this is what God, some other guy over here prophesied this, that he would become president, that he's our man. We know he's rough around the edges, but he's like our Cyrus, and in the Old Testament, who God used even though he wasn't a believer. And so they just kind of like, oh, played right into it. And that's, again, the ends justifies the means, even though that you see these norms being broken and pushing the envelope on all kinds of things, becoming more retributive, etc. A lot of unchristian attitudes and actions. It didn't matter, because it was fulfilling their agenda. Not
Yeah,
everyone, of course, was on
right.
board with Trump, so we have to be fair about that. But that's largely what happened, right?
Yeah, and one of the one of the things that any thoughtful Christian must be able to account for is how could, even today, right now, I saw a poll, 77% of evangelicals say they will support Trump if he's the nominee in 2024.
Yeah.
So how could that be? Um, and one answer is the Republican plus evangelical marriage is now 50 years old, right? But the other is, I think my paradigm of authoritarian reactionary Christianity actually works pretty well. You don't have to be a nice person. You don't have to really be a practicing believer. You don't have to know what's what in the Bible. If you promise people, I will win your culture wars at last.
Yes.
I will restore you to power. Everybody you're mad at, I'm even more mad at. Everybody you would like to get back at, I actually do get back at them because I don't have any scruples. And any rules that might have hindered previous polite people from winning these battles, I'm not going to worry about those rules. In other words, authoritarian reactionary Christianity.
Right.
You could be a vicious misanthrope with no conscience, but if you promise those things right now, there's a certain percentage of the Christian population that will hail you as God's man.
Right. Yeah. It's very sad, but it's true. Yeah. And then there's this attitude that, eventually came out with the 2020 election. Okay, yeah, right. Democracy is fine, but only if you win. If you don't win, uh, really, what matters most for us religious people, and for, Trump leading this movement, is loyalty to the religious revolution that we want, rather than democracy. I mean, how did that pivot to go from, okay, he's our man, but now that he's lost, well, maybe a lot of people just believe the balderdash about, the election being stolen, but I know a lot of people knew better. But why did they still go and support Trump?
Um, a democracy only works if if they consider themselves bound to accept the results of elections.
Mhm.
Um, but certain components that go with that is it really helps if you believe that the people on the other side also love the country and they're not evil. But
Right.
if you convince yourself that the people on the other side don't love the country, they're actually secret enemies and they are evil. And especially if you mix some theology in there that says, I know what God's will is, God is declaring that our guy will win, then you get that layer of magical kind of theology on that too,
Right.
So, if the if the voting machines give you numbers that you don't like, then you conclude that the voting machines were rigged. You have to believe that because you've set yourself up that the other belief is unbearable. Uh,
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean,
right.
the
Yeah.
the us versus them thing you said is really important because, in my experience, that was always there in evangelical churches, and now years later, it's so much more predominant that the other side is, like you said, they're demonized so that if we actually lost this election, the country would go to pot and everything would be it's just untenable. We cannot go there. And instead of having a McCain attitude of, oh, Obama won, and people saying, oh, the country's going to pot, and McCain says, no, no, we're going to be okay. He's a good man. We disagree on policy, but all of a sudden that's
Yeah.
out the window,
Yeah.
right?
That I think, think about, I mean, Romney was the nominee in 2012. He had that attitude, right?
Right.
McCain was the nominee in 2008.
Yep.
George W. was the nominee in 2000, 2004. None of them would have transgressed these boundaries. None of them did transgress these boundaries.
Right. Well, and even Hillary Clinton gave a concession speech, the day or two after.
It's
Said,
hard,
okay, I lost.
right?
Good.
But if facts don't matter as much as propaganda or ideology, um, you think about the conspiracy thinking, the way that it has really taken off, QAnon, um, and of course, Trump is a conspiracy thinker and has been his entire adult life. So people have gone. Some people, not a majority of Americans, I'd say it's no more than 20%, but have gone around the bend to some place where reality is unbearable. So they're believing a lot of fiction, including the idea that if things were fair, our side would always win,
Right.
and Trump is God's tribune in politics and stuff like that. It's an unstable and rather inflammable, flammable mix to have in anybody's politics. It's really,
Right.
really gross. Yeah.
So, unfortunately, if Trump goes away, he's convicted and banished from politics. This is not going to go away, right? This is already baked in.
I think it is. I think the results of the 2022 midterm elections were interesting because there were little mini Trumps. Talk about
Mhm.
several of them
Yeah.
in the book, like Kerry Lake in Arizona and
Right.
Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania. A number of these mini Trumps lost, and they lost in some cases pretty decisively. I think DeSantis was positioning himself to be the successor, um, and may still be, but he seems to lack some of the magic, whatever the magic is that makes this work for
Right.
Trump.
Right. Yeah. He's not likable.
Not likable. You can't.
Trump
Yeah,
is likable to some people. So,
to some people, and not enough for DeSantis.
right. Right.
But but authoritarianism is not going away. Reactionary spirit is not going away. And some of the hits on democracy itself, now that the frontier has been breached, that means new things are thinkable. So yes, the danger continues for
Yeah,
sure.
that's sad. Okay, we got a little more than 15 minutes to go, and I want to spend a lot of more time on the solutions.
Okay.
What we can do, and what Christians can do who are actually seeing this or want to influence their friends and neighbors. And you bring up a couple things, traditions. One of them is called the Baptist Democratic tradition, and the other one is the Black Christian democratic tradition, and saying this even among Christians, we have a history of loving democracy and we're losing it. How can we get back to it? So how would you answer that?
I like how you said that, Michael. We have a history of loving democracy. It's not all Christians.
Right.
Um, in fact, I talk in the book about some Christians who've been showing for a while that they don't really want American democracy. They want something more like Puritan New England in 1690 or something, right? Or they
Right.
want medieval France in 1200. But there are resources, and so I named three. One of them is the Baptist democratic tradition, and it isn't only the Baptists; it's all kinds of Congregationalists and dissenters that you begin to see emerge in England, for example, in the 16th and 17th century. They began arguing for things that sure look like democracy long before liberal and secular theorists like John Locke began writing their work.
Okay.
They said theocracy is bad because the state does not have the right, nor does it do well when it attempts to enforce religion.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They said the power should be diffused because human nature is sinful. You can't concentrate power in the hands of one person.
Right.
They said people have rights because they're made in the image of God.
Right. So not including non-Christians.
Including non-Christians. So
Right.
at first they were begging for their own rights. Please don't kill us because we do like adult baptism. Okay.
Right.
But then they were saying, but also don't kill the Jews and the Quakers and the Muslims and the atheists, because conscience, the right to freedom of conscience is one of the highest human rights of all.
Right.
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 So they were the ones who began eventually saying, you know what we need? We need the state to get out of the religion business altogether.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We need the separation of church and state, so that the church is free. The churches, people are free to form churches that they believe in, and the state doesn't harass them, but it also doesn't tax to support them. And the state has plenty to do, like providing for defense and education. It's plenty to do. It doesn't need to be regulating religion.
Right.
So the Baptists, the Anabaptists, the Quakers, the ones who had spent a lot of time dying at stakes and stuff, or being thrown into prison, they began to offer the first case for what ended up happening in our country, a country in which the government is not officially Christian, but it's not hostile to Christianity, in which there's religious liberty, and in which the you might say the moral atmosphere of the country is set by the people.
Mm-hmm.
And the government of the country is actually led by the people instead of by the monarch. So I say everywhere that Christians still have in their marrow this democratic sensibility, it's a resource for democracy.
Yeah, that's right. Okay.
Talking about churches, where like people get together and they form a church and they create a covenant and they write bylaws and they pick ministers and they run their own affairs and have done for hundreds of years.
But you're talking about congregational polity in
Yes,
churches, right?
I
Yeah,
am.
so that's more of a democratic. It's not just the pastor and the rubber stamp board. It's the whole congregation voting on things.
That's right. And the whole congregation deliberating on what we want to be as a people. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that is already there as a resource, but we have to protect it.
Right.
Because even in a lot of Congregationalist churches, there is indeed the all-powerful pastor now in the rubber stamp board, right?
Yeah. Right. No, that's what my experience was. Even though I think my Baptist church did have a congregational structure, I believe, but you also have the issue of like theology having to be the statements of faith and everything, and not having non-negotiables that are kind of strict, etc. But that's another issue. But
Right.
anyways, this is very interesting. You reminded me of Roger Williams when you started talking about
Right.
this.
Roger Williams. He's the
Yeah.
hero of this strand of thought that I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
he's a hero. He's, he left the Puritans to form the Rhode Island colony, and had some pretty radical ideas, like compensating the Native Americans for their land,
Yeah.
as well as all the things you just talked about.
I've been reading in 17th century British history, and I'm seeing that the kings were very worried about these Congregationalist movements.
Yeah. Okay.
Because they understood that Congregationalism had a democratic vibe to it.
Mm-hmm.
If the people can govern themselves in matters of religion, why do they need a king?
Yeah.
And
Right.
the parliament, the growing parliamentary movement in the 17th century, had some of that, like, hey, we know about forming communities and governing ourselves, and we want more of a voice in our own affairs.
Yeah.
So So I'm saying that that is a resource. And so one thing I'm saying is if you have a congregationalist system, protect it, and think about using it as an opportunity to train people explicitly in the practices of democracy.
Hmm.
Like writing constitutions and drafting bylaws and amending them and having intelligent discussions about issues and taking stands and voting and then staying in community even when your side loses and all of that, right? Um,
Right.
all of that is democracy in action.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The Black democratic tradition, I give a chapter to it because in America, Black people were disenfranchised from the beginning, enslaved. Black people have known from the beginning that what we have called democracy has been damaged by racism, and and so some of the most inspiring pro-democratic voices in all of our history are, like freed slaves like Frederick Douglass,
Right.
or
Douglas.
scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois, or
Hmm.
leaders like Martin Luther King,
Hmm.
or Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, this is not truly a democracy until we have equal rights.
Right.
Then that would also mean it's not truly a democracy until everyone has equal rights.
Exactly. Yes. Right.
A multiracial democracy where everybody gets one vote, everybody gets one place at the table.
Hmm.
The table is round and we all have a seat. And the Black democratic tradition, often headquartered in the churches, has been fighting for real democracy here for hundreds of years. And that is a treasure. And some of the writings and the voices coming out of the Black churches are absolutely essential for us all to consider as we think about protecting our democracy now.
Right. No, it's a great example. Um, and I think it always struck me in my evangelical experience that when I did encounter Black churches, they were quite different.
Yeah.
There's a different flavor there. Um, and they were always more, I don't know, social justice oriented. They seemed to me much more open, and then, like you say, they had a strong sense of what was fair for all of society because of their own experiences, with injustice throughout history and slavery, etc. So
They're also not likely to be romantic about the great, great old days of the past.
exact. Oh yeah, right. They
You know?
yeah they don't think, oh, make America great again. Oh, you mean like the Jim Crow era? Or what are you talking about?
Right. They have a counter history to the mythologized history of nostalgic white people.
That's a very good point.
We need
Yeah.
them. Absolutely. We need
Right,
those.
we don't wanna go backwards, we wanna go forwards. Come
Right.
on, guys,
Yep.
right, yeah. So that's very interesting. How can these examples have influence on our society? What can be done?
Um, I closed the book by trying to retrieve the language of covenant, and to say, and this is not my own idea. Covenant, it was a concept from the Bible that the Puritans picked up to describe their political and religious vision. Um, that is written into some of our constitutions, state constitutions in the U.S. Martin Luther King said we need a new democratic covenant. A new democratic covenant. I remember, I think it was I.F. Stone who said during the civil rights years, either this country moves forward to like essentially a new democratic covenant in which everybody is included, or we're going to move backward into fascism.
Wow.
And that's I think the choice that we really have. And so I'm calling on Christians to make a covenant with their neighbors to to defend democracy, to be committed to equal human rights and civil rights for all, to accept pluralism, to not have to dictate the values of everybody, to live out the way of life that we believe in without demanding that other people live out our way of life as well,
Right.
to protect religious liberty, real religious liberty for all, and to honor freedom of conscience, and to be committed to the common good of the whole society. This project, this backward looking project of authoritarian reactionary Christianity, I would say is bad theology and bad politics. And
Right.
so we have to consider it at both levels. It's bad ethics. It doesn't reflect love of God and neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. How would we like to be treated if we were the minority group?
Right, do unto others, yeah.
Yes, I mean, how simple is that, right?
So what you just described, what I've envisioned is that if there's a document, a case for, Christian democracy, a Christian perspective on democracy, and getting churches to covenant to agree to this because it's, appealing to the teachings of Jesus, appealing to history, appealing to logic, appealing to justice for all, etc. Some of the foundations of our country. Is anyone doing this? Is anyone saying, "Hey, here's a document. Let's talk to churches about this"?
I'm not aware of such a document. I'd be happy to be in any conversation where it was being developed. I
Yeah,
imagine there will be things in the upcoming election year where people will um, work on various kinds of documents. And in one sense, my contribution to the conversation is this book. Like
right. Absolutely.
I'm
Yeah,
saying, hey, let's do this. We can do better, and we
right.
must do better. And so I hope that maybe some of the concepts that I've been able to name and to retrieve here can be part of a constructive conversation in the upcoming year and in years to come.
Right, right. Good. Okay. So, anything else you wanna add that you covered in the book that, we haven't talked about?
I think I would want to leave people with hope. Um, I think that 2020, 21, especially the insurrection, was a real shock to most Americans, and the sense of never wanting to go there again is pretty strong. And then in 2022, as I said, some of the people who were nominated lost, especially in swing states. So that the 6 or 7 states in our weird electoral college system that helps settle every election, a,
Right.
a lot of the people, the radical candidates, they lost,
Yep.
which gives me hope for how the elections will be
Yeah.
administered in those states.
Mhm.
So also Trump himself, there is some statute of limitations on Trump. He's not going to last forever. This will probably be his last election, no matter what, if he is the nominee. Um, so I'm asking us to summon ourselves to defend democracy. And there's good reason to think that we can do so, but we need to mobilize and not take anything for granted.
Right, right. No, I like what you said about being hopeful too. I mean, there are signs of hope, but then there's always we just took a big step forward, and then all of a sudden it seems like we're taking a step and a half back or something. So it's tough to maintain some optimism about things, but I think we have to do that. I really appreciate your case for this. This is a really good case, folks, for getting back to some of our democratic values, and especially if you're a Christian, to embrace some of these things because of the heritage, the legacy of Christians um, embracing democracy, and because of the teachings of Christ and so forth. And I think this really resonates with a lot of ex-evangelicals who've come out of the church, but also can resonate with evangelicals who are concerned and aren't part of that. I don't know. What did you say? 70% who would vote
20%.
for Trump
Oh, 77% right now say they will vote for Trump. Right.
in the Republican Party or the church?
70%, 77% of evangelicals. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's amazing. Right, that's right. Anyways, do you consider yourself still in the evangelical movement, but on the fringes, or
No,
what are you?
no, I think evangelicalism has made so many wrong turns by now. Plus, they kicked me out anyway. So hey,
Right,
I'm in the post-evangelical space, and that's where I belong, and that's cool. There's a lot of folks in that space for sure.
right. No, I agree. Yeah, I definitely agree. So, okay, well, we are just about an hour in here, and this has been a wonderful conversation. So great to get to know you, David, and talk about your book. Folks, it's Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. And where can you find it? I assume on Amazon, of
On
course.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble has it. Independent bookstores. Yeah, it's out, and you
Oh,
can get audio, ebook, or print.
oh, you have audio now too.
Yeah,
Great.
audio's
And
out.
do you have a website where people can learn more about
Yeah,
you?
davidpgushee.com.
davidpgushee.com. Okay, great. Thanks again, David. It's great to have you on. And Folks, until the next episode, enjoy responsibly.